Our event this afternoon is presented by McCarthy, the great employee-owned construction company, with support from our gold sponsors, two Fortune 200 companies, Jacobs and Texas Instruments. I want to talk for just a minute about the work we've been doing the last 4 months. I'm so proud of all of our DRC team and all we've accomplished in the last 4 months. We quickly shifted our operations to serve our members the best way we knew how in a virtual work from home environment. We produced dozens and dozens of material related to COVID-19 and the path forward as we look to return to the office safely in the months ahead. We thought we were going to go there a little bit faster than we have, but we had another little spike. We've been also putting on many more events like this. And then most recently, in the past couple of weeks after the tragic killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, so painful for all of us, we moved very quickly, and we were proud to announce last week the formation of a new Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council at the Chamber. This is only staffed by board members. It's the only one like it at the Chamber now, and we'll work in 4 pillars: diversity and leadership, education and workforce, community investment in underserved areas, and policing and criminal justice issues. We also announced that we're going to be hiring a senior vice president for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to source our candidates in July, and we're going to do the interviewing in August. And our hope is to have somebody in place in that senior role by Labor Day. No other organization in Dallas has moved so quickly or so decisively to put a permanent framework in place at both the board level and the management level to ensure that these issues are front and center every day. And we believe that these actions have strengthened the DRC and our community for the long term. And we appreciate everyone who's leaned in, and we're excited to continue to do the work to lead the change in Dallas to make us the best place in America for all people to live, work, and do business. Today, we're going to be hearing from our friend, Congressman Colin Allred. He represents the 32nd District of Texas. Congressman, thank you for being with us today. Congressman is going to update us on the recently passed legislation called Invest in America Act, which is a $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill aimed at implementing a new vision for surface and rail transportation. So here's the format for today. Our good friend Joe Juvenal, McCarthy's president of the Southern Region, will make opening remarks. Joe will then introduce the congressman and our moderator, Chris Lawrence of WFAA TV. Then Bob Pragada, the president and chief operating officer at Jacobs, will transition us from our conversation to the question and answer period. You can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions throughout the conversation. And we'll wrap up by 3 o'clock. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Joe Juvenal. I see Joe on Saturday mornings with his family playing tennis, and we play at the same club. It's wonderful. He's got a wonderful family, and I love to see him there on Saturday mornings. Joe serves as the president of the Southern Region for McCarthy, the commercial construction leader with over 150 years of industry experience. McCarthy believes strong and efficient infrastructure is the foundation of our best communities. Joe, thanks for your support and the critical role you and McCarthy are playing in the Dallas region's infrastructure. I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Dale. McCarthy has been building in Dallas-Fort Worth for nearly 40 years. And as a business, we've been fortunate to have grown right alongside the city. This is in part due to the fact that McCarthy is an infrastructure builder as well as a commercial builder. As Dallas has grown, so have the demands of our local infrastructure. And McCarthy has been here to deliver on those infrastructure projects. Many of the types of projects McCarthy has constructed in Dallas are the same types of projects included in the legislation Congressman Allred is going to talk about today. Yeah, we build roads and bridges, which are really the most recognizable infrastructure projects, but McCarthy is also an industry leader in building water and wastewater projects, port work, solar fields, and also critical service building projects like education and healthcare facilities. If you've been to Clyde Warren Park, or you've parked at Terminal E at DFW Airport, you've connected with a McCarthy project. Just as solid infrastructure is essential to our city's ability to attract new business and talent to our community, these types of projects are really necessary for McCarthy and other companies like us investing in local workforce to support the future needs of our region. We're a general contractor and we employ a workforce of construction management professionals, but also a significant number of skilled labor workers. The commitment and talent of our skilled labor workforce is what allows us to deliver quality projects, to serve our neighborhoods, but also to provide jobs. Because of their importance in the work that we do, the development of our skilled labor employees is one of our top priorities. Being able to maintain consistent employment for this group is critical to our ability to provide services to those companies and organizations when we're needed. And even more importantly, it's critical for these employees to be able to consistently provide for their families. The projects included in the Invest in America Act will bring meaningful job opportunities to Dallas in the construction industry and beyond. As a local business and a builder that relies on local talent, the Invest in America Act represents an opportunity for McCarthy to continue developing talent for the construction industry and to provide stable employment opportunities for our workforce, while still playing a key role in the growth of the city that we're a part of. And now I'd like to introduce our guest of honor. Congressman Colin Allred, a Dallas native, has represented his home district since being elected in November of 2018. After a career playing in the NFL and as general counsel with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, he dedicated this next chapter to public service. The Congressman and I share a real appreciation for trade and vocational schools and the value that they can bring to our community. I'm looking forward to hearing his comments today and learning more about the legislation that could offer students attending our local trade schools job opportunities in the future. We're so grateful to have you with us today, Congressman. And moderating the discussion today, as Dale mentioned, with Congressman Allred is Chris Lawrence, co-anchor at WFAA. Congressman Allred and Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, Joe, thank you so much and welcome, Representative Allred.
Good to see you, Chris. And hi to Joe and Dale and everybody at the DRC. Good to be with y'all.
Let me dive into it. Unlike the original Invest in America Act, the Moving Forward Act that just passed was a lot more expensive, and it passed pretty much on party lines. Is there enough goodwill left between the chambers to get an infrastructure package passed before the end of the year?
Well, thank you, Chris. And, I certainly hope so. And I think that we all recognize that this is not a want to, this is a need to. And in Washington, those distinctions matter. This is not something that we want to do, that would be nice to do. This is something that we really need to do. And we did in this legislation include a number, dozens and dozens of Republican amendments to try and make sure that they had as much input as possible. And so, I think that the end product is one that should be able to draw some support in the Senate. And I hope that it can, and hopefully we'll reach some agreements on infrastructure. The good news, I think, is that we are in agreement about the need for it. We may not be in total agreement on some of the details, and that's where we're going to have to iron things out. But I think that we recognize not only for North Texas our tremendous growth, and I think our Texas delegation realizes what's happening here in Texas, but also that we're still living in many ways off of the federal infrastructure system from the Eisenhower administration, and that we have to update that. This is a $1.5 trillion package that we put forward just for you to understand what the experts are saying we need for our nation's infrastructure to come up and be brought back up to the level that the engineers say we should reach. We need a $3 trillion investment. So this is not even approaching that. And there are some important things, I think, for us, as Joe was mentioning, for North Texas, and some things that I hope we can maybe talk about some provisions that I think have great applicability for us and that I hope do become law.
Can I ask, I know this act sets aside money for zero emissions buses. I think it triples the budget for the funding for Amtrak, with no guarantee that ridership in public transportation will ever go back to what it was pre-pandemic. Is it wise to invest so much in those public transportation projects, or is it better to take some of that money and move it into roads and bridges and other infrastructure?
Well, we have to do both. And we do have nearly, I think, $319 billion for our highways and roadways to try and restore and rebuild that around the country. And then we do make some historic investments in public transit, not just Amtrak, but also, as you mentioned, things like DART that will receive much more support under this project. And we're also supporting high-speed rail. And I think that's something that has a lot of interest for us here in North Texas with the Texas Central project, trying to build a high-speed train between Dallas and Houston, connecting our 5th and 4th largest metropolitan centers in the country by a 90-minute high-speed train. I think that's important. Now, you're right about the concerns around COVID-19 and the coronavirus. That is certainly something that has caused a deep hit to transit agencies across the country. But we will beat COVID eventually. The question is, when we emerge from that, what is our country's infrastructure going to look like? What is our local infrastructure going to look like? And what we have seen and what the experts have told us is that as excited as we are about some of the road projects that we've built here in North Texas, and we've done better than most places in the country in terms of using public-private partnerships to build roadways and to try to ease some of our congestion issues. We cannot use that alone. That's not going to be enough with our explosive growth. We're going to have to diversify the options that folks have to get around. And that means not only providing public transit, but that it has to be more convenient. And I think that's the biggest thing, Chris, that we're aiming to do in North Texas is make our public transit more convenient, because there's been some good adjustments made in Houston, for example, where they have seen ridership increase as their transit agency did a better job of being more convenient. DART is moving in that direction as well. We want to support them in those efforts. And so when folks do get back to, when we have a vaccine or we have a therapeutic that allows us to be on the other side of this virus, these investments are going to be necessary. And we want to make sure these agencies, these transit agencies that have taken these big hits during this period, that they're still there and that they can still provide services.
Over the past 4 months, we've seen the tremendous need for broadband access, not only with the education system in our children's schools, but also the demand in hospitals for telemedicine. What does this bill do to address some of those needs in terms of broadband access?
Yeah. Well, we're trying to extend broadband to every American family, and that's what we want to see, is to see in all parts of the country by promoting competition and making it easier for access to try and not only reach more customers for the providers of broadband, but of course, as more importantly, reach more families and give them a chance to engage in this modern economy. You probably have seen in the Dallas Morning News, I think recently wrote about a third of Dallas families not having access to high-speed internet at home during a time when we're asking kids to stay home and learn from home, and maybe going forward having some version of that in the fall and even into next spring. And so that's a real problem for us when we see kids having to go to a McDonald's parking lot or to the local, anywhere else locally that has Wi-Fi to try and do their homework. That's something we want to solve. And it's also a problem in our rural areas. So this is not an urban-rural divide. We recognize that in our rural areas, there are too many folks who don't have access to high-speed internet. So we're trying to incentivize this. We're trying to provide the funding to make it possible. And I do think this is a bipartisan issue. I think it's something that everybody can get behind. Everybody wants to see us expand broadband across the country into all areas of the country. And I think it's something that will happen eventually and will certainly, I think, make us a stronger area and a stronger country when we do it.
In terms of targeting that need to get the funds where they need to be, I think it was back in March where the president signed the Broadband Data Act. What else needs to be done in terms of broadband mapping?
Well, we need to incentivize and make it possible for our providers to be in areas where they couldn't previously be. And that's something that we've seen. When I was at HUD and the Obama administration, we had a pilot project called Connect Home, where we went into public housing institutions and tried to provide them with high-speed internet and worked with our providers to get into those facilities. It provided them with a new customer base, and of course, it also helped the residents of those communities. And so it was a win-win for everyone. But sometimes in certain areas, it's not economically feasible, or there's not the actual physical infrastructure in place for broadband to exist there. And that's what we have to either subsidize or incentivize. And that's what we're trying to do.
And sort of a sidebar to that, in terms of the digital world, Google and Facebook dominate digital advertising. Does Congress need to follow the UK's lead in terms of setting up a new regulatory agency to promote some of the competition in these digital platforms?
You know, I think that we need to follow the lead in some ways of what's gone on in Europe and in California in terms of privacy and data, and trying to make sure that we continue to have a free and open internet, but also one where your information and your identity are not just commodities that you don't know what's happening with them. And that's something that really concerns me. And I think that when I've spoken to our folks who are engaged in this business, they want consistency across the country, and they don't want to have a patchwork of laws that they are having to comply with, having different regulations in California, different regulations in Texas and New York, because for them that's not only much more expensive on a regulatory side, but it does make it harder for smaller new businesses, for entrepreneurs to get off the ground when they have so much difficulty complying with some standards that may be different in different places. So I'd like to see us have a national standard for the use of privacy, also for competition, as you said. And there are some concerns that I have around antitrust and around some monopolies that I think have been formed in some areas through our burgeoning digital economy. And we can't be afraid of ensuring that competition remains at the core of this, but that competition is fair and that it's not taking advantage of people. Because what we've learned from some of the practices that have come out of Facebook in particular is really troubling. It's really troubling what folks, I don't think, realize the power they're giving and the amount of their lives that they're giving over to some of these companies. And that's, in many ways, our regulatory framework has not caught up to the current state of what we're dealing with. And so we need to advance that. And I think that's part of why also we need to have folks in Congress who know about what's happening in the 21st century and are paying attention and can ensure that we are keeping an eye on this, because it's a new problem. It's going to require a new thinking. And I don't want to shut down these tech companies or make it so their business models don't work. Far from it. But I want to make sure that it's a fair system and one that people can have confidence in, and then one that you know what's happening with your data and with your information.
And before we leave infrastructure entirely, when talking with your colleagues, is there a greater sense of support for larger, more long-term projects, whether that be roads or bridges, or is the support mainly for shovel-ready projects that can give some immediate juice to the economy?
Yeah. Well, I think in our committee, there's certainly support for long-term investments. I mean, we're talking, folks who maybe be in the Gulf of Mexico area, in Mississippi, Louisiana, where they have enormous investments that they need. New Jersey wanting big investments there. Texas, we have huge needs. You go across the country, I think we certainly realize that while there's a lot of shovel-ready projects that are ready to go right now, that we are the only entity that can do the long-term planning, that can provide the funding that's necessary to have a long-term vision. And we have to be clear about this. We haven't made that investment since the Eisenhower era. We haven't made that kind of long-term planning. Even the Recovery Act from the Obama administration that did put a lot of money into infrastructure was for, as you said, shovel-ready projects. And it was the kind of thing that was trying to promote to stimulate the economy, which is really important. But that long-term planning and that long-term funding source that allows for long-term planning is what only we can provide. And so, you know, it's been one of the interesting things about my time here in Congress in this first term has been that we, in the Democratic side, have always said we want to do infrastructure. I certainly joined the committee that I'm on because I want to work on infrastructure. On the Republican side, they have said they want to do infrastructure. The president has said he wants to do infrastructure. Everyone says they want to do infrastructure, and we still have not quite come together on it. And that's been a real frustration for me because when you have that sort of unanimity, you would hope that you could get something done on it. And as I said, these are not things that we want to do. These are things that we have to do. For us in North Texas, we are growing so rapidly that to stay in front of that growth and to keep up with it, really, we're going to have to make serious investments. And the other part that I'll just add is dealing with the revenue shortfalls that we're going to see for our cities, our counties, and for the states due to COVID-19. You know, we've already seen the state saying they're probably going to make 5% cuts across the board. The city of Dallas is making furloughs and going to have to make deep cuts. Same for Dallas County. And so those cuts are going to eventually also get into our infrastructure planning and some of the things that we had hoped to do. And so that's another thing I want to make sure we shore up and cover at the federal level to make sure that we don't impact those projects.
And speaking of that, with the numbers being what they are in Texas and in going in the wrong direction, you know, some have said we may be facing a second shutdown. What sort of financial aid packages are at least being talked about or considered that would help alleviate some of the economic pain that people are feeling and could continue to feel?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that I believe we have to get done in this next package is what I said, covering the revenue shortfalls for our cities, our counties, and our states, because, you know, they can't operate in the red. And so if you have, you know, 600 million fewer dollars coming in the door as Texas is looking at, then you're just going to have to make that same cut to the services you provide. Same for the city of Dallas and for other entities. And, you know, there's not a whole lot there that can already be cut. We were still recovering in many ways from some of the cuts that we had during the Great Recession of 08 and 09 and during that period. And so we were really just starting to get back to where we were in terms of investment in education and other things at the statewide level. And I really don't want to see us go backwards there. It's also, it's a problem for us because when you make cuts in the public sector, they are much slower to come back, both those jobs and the services they provide. So you're not able to provide services to folks who may need it in a number of different areas at a time when they need those services the most. So we had $1 trillion in our HEROES Act that we passed in Congress to cover that revenue shortfall. I think that will be part of the next package that's negotiated that will become law, and I hope it will. The other is dealing with unemployment. That's going to be running out at the end of next month, or end of this month, I should say. And so we need to make sure that we extend some of the unemployment benefits because we still are seeing double-digit unemployment. It may not be the same $600 a month that it was in our first CARES Act. It may be less than that, but we need to see that extended. Secretary Mnuchin has also said that he will consider and would support, I think, doing another round of direct payments to individuals to try and send, I think last time he had $1,200 checks to folks to allow them to, you know, have some spending money. That's something that I'm sure will be considered. If the White House wants to do it, then that'll probably be part of the package. And then of course, PPP. We still have, I think, $130 billion or so left in the PPP program. But I'm co-sponsoring some legislation to allow companies to take a second dip into PPP, and I hope that will pass. And then those funds may be taken up because, as we're seeing, some states are just now reopening. Some states like Texas may have to go back into some forms of shutdown. So the pain that PPP was supposed to address is still going to be there, and I'm sure also will be the desire to draw on it.
And when you look at that, the potential to allow individuals and companies to take a second dip, so to speak, I realized with the first initiative, the idea was to get that money to people as quickly as possible because they were, you know, hemorrhaging funds. Do you anticipate that any further legislation would put stricter protocols in place in terms of accessing those funds?
Well, the Treasury Department and SBA have already, through regulations, kind of narrowed some of the scope of who can get access to the funds. And in our second round of funding for PPP, we did set aside $60 billion to try and really target some of the small businesses and the types of small businesses that were not getting access to PPP funds. And I'm thinking here, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, folks that were so small that they maybe had not had needed access to credit in the past and weren't the most sophisticated in terms of accessing that. And so we targeted the financial institutions, the CDFIs, minority-owned lending institutions that already have better relationships, credit unions that can do a good job in really reaching down into our small business community, because that's one of our biggest concerns through this is, while we're seeing some of the more sophisticated businesses be able to go through the process and get access to the funding and getting quite a bit of money, it's some of the mom and pop shops, some of the folks who, as I said, have not always needed to have access to credit or didn't have access to it previously, that are falling by the wayside. And we don't want to emerge from this with 30, 35, 40% of our small businesses not reopening because they were unable to stay alive through this. And we, of course, also want their employees, and that's the point of PPP, is to keep their employees paid so that they can, when they come back, they'll still have folks on the books who can get right back to work. So I'm sure that we will continue to push for transparency with PPP. We want to make sure that folks know it's your tax dollars being spent. And I think it's a good program, and don't get me wrong, I certainly support it. But we want to make sure that you know where it went, and then that we can also follow where it went, so that we can make sure that certainly there's no malfeasance or anything like that going on. But I think we're going to continue to try through every mechanism we have, and I appreciate the DRC and others for working on this too, to try and really help the small new businesses that are the ones who we have had the hardest time reaching, and who I think have had the highest hurdle in terms of getting the paperwork together and applying for this and getting through the whole process. We want to make sure they get access to.
From some of the small business owners that we've spoken to over the last couple of months, it seems like one of the issues with the first program was a lot of it just came down to which bank you were using and your relationship with that particular bank. And if your bank happened to be nimble enough to move that application forward fast enough to grab the money before it was gone, that's more of a private issue. What role could Congress potentially play in sort of leveling that playing field?
Yeah, it's a tough issue because we know that for most of our banks, they first processed loans from people they had existing financial relationships with. And so if you didn't have that existing relationship, you went to the back of the line and were considered maybe later. And while I certainly understand our financial institutions need to do their due diligence so that they're not engaging in any kind of fraud, and to understand who they're lending to, even though it is 100% federally backed loan, so they're not going to lose money. They may lose, they may be on the hook in terms of some kind of malfeasance or something like that. I understand that, but I've heard way too many stories about folks who were unable to get access to funding until the second round because they applied with a national bank and didn't hear much back. And we've heard a lot of stories also about folks having better experience with local banks and with smaller banks that maybe have fewer folks they're dealing with and are able to provide more attention and more feedback on what's going on. And so, as I mentioned, we think that making sure that the institutions that are really at the grassroots level as much as possible, our CDFIs, our minority-owned institutions, credit unions, some of our other lenders that are really the ones who do microloans and are really developing those relationships with our even smallest businesses, that making sure they are also part of PPP is really important. And so that's why we set aside dedicated $60 billion for that category. I'm sure we will continue to fund and try to find these institutions that we think are more efficient at reaching in and really getting down to at the grassroots level, and can actually even go out and try to proactively find small business owners and help them. And that's something that we are going to try and do as well. It's just we're going to do everything we can, but this is an important point that groups like the Chamber, DRC, that can play such an important role in helping us spread the information about what's available to you, that there is still money available, that if you need help going through the process, you can call my office. If you're not in my district, you can call your member of Congress's office. We're here to help. We want to get you through this process.
I know that Senator McConnell and Senator Cornyn are working on legislation that would limit the liabilities of healthcare workers and business owners when it comes to COVID-19. I think one of the things under consideration is maybe a retroactive insulation back to December and going forward to 2024. Where do things stand on negotiations in terms of liability protections?
Yeah, I do think that'll probably be part of the next package. And I support some protections for folks who are doing the right things, who have, in many cases, taken on expenses to try and make their business safe for folks to come into and for their workers to work in. Those are the businesses that we don't want to see be turned around and sued or have legal action brought against them through no fault of their own, something happening in their business. But we don't want to provide blanket immunity. And I think that's also a mistake, because we know that there are some entities out there that haven't been as responsible and that are not trying to protect their workers, and they're maybe not as concerned with the public health aspect of this. So it's a balance. But I was signed on to a letter that was circulated by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Chamber, to our leadership, recommending that we include some protections. And I think it's particularly for our small businesses that are going to be, that really cannot afford to be involved in litigation like this. That's going to be very important for them. And I've heard the speaker say in past comments of hers that she thinks that there can be something done on that. So I'm hopeful that we may actually find some agreement there. I'm sure it'll be part of the ongoing negotiation of the overall package that's coming, because I think it'll probably be the last package we have this year.
And just one last thing, with early voting wrapping up here, I guess in a couple of days, the polling right now in Texas, for what it's worth, is showing a fairly tight race in November. Do you think this is the year where Texas, is actually looked at as a swing state?
Well, we are a close state, and that's, I think, good for our politics here. And what I mean by that is, having single party rule where you don't have any kind of worry about representing, 45, 46% of your state can lead to some of the extremes that we've seen in our state legislature, and that groups like our business community, like DRC and some of our business community, have fought back on ideas like the bathroom bill a couple sessions ago because it'd be bad for business. I think competitive elections are good for our democracy. I think it's good for Texas to have competitive elections. I think it's good for us to have a testing of ideas and to have new ideas come forward. And that, I think, is going to happen here. And I think it'll be good for us. And, we are certainly a single digit state, no matter how you look at it. It's going to end up being in the low single digits, the margin, whether it's a win or a loss for Vice President Biden here in Texas. I'm a proud supporter of his. I think he would make an excellent president. But regardless of that, I do think that for us as a state, we need to have a more robust conversation, politically speaking, that includes the voices of a lot of folks who for years have felt like they didn't have any representation at the statewide level. And I think that will help us across the board and will improve our quality of representation as well.
All right. Thank you, Representative Allred. Before we move into the question and answer period, I want to turn it over to one of our gold sponsors, Jacobs.
Thanks, Chris.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Chris. We are so proud to be the gold sponsor of today's event. Thank you, Congressman Allred, for your interesting comments and providing us some great insight into the $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill aimed at implementing a new vision for surface and rail transportation, as well as infrastructure broadly. I will have to say that I did learn some new phrases today, Congressman, that I'm going to liberally plagiarize. I love your comment around we're going from a potential swing state to a close state, and being a close state, there's a lot of benefit there. And the whole changing the narrative from want to need to was very, very inspiring. So thank you for that. At Jacobs, we've had a long, proud history of serving not only TxDOT and global transportation clients, to include both highways as well as rail transit, but broadly across the infrastructure market around the globe. So we're very, very encouraged to see this bill come to fruition. You notice I said not potentially come to fruition, but come to fruition. In our view, infrastructure investment is the smartest way to create long-term economic growth. I didn't realize it was the Eisenhower era, Congressman, but it's been way, way too long. And so providing robust and reliable public transit to keep our communities and our cities moving will be a valued and critical part of continued recovery from this pandemic. Jacobs has been and continues to work in partnership with our clients to keep their projects progressing and to anticipate and develop new solutions for a world with COVID. And I think that's something that we really got to get our arms around, is that this is not post-COVID, this is a world with COVID. And in our great state of Texas, we're a big player in that, as well as in the global footprint that we serve. So thank you very much for your incredible efforts in the House. I want to share your optimism of how it's going to pass through the Senate, and but having people like you represent us here in the great state of Texas is a real honor. So thank you for all you're doing for us. Now, before I turn back over to Chris, please remember to submit any questions for Congressman Allred in the chat room function or the chat function below. And again, Dale, thank you so much for allowing us to be a sponsor for this important conversation. And Chris, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Bob. Representative Allred, question here from our audience. Are there any proposals right now to abandon PPP for a wage support program?
Yeah, there is a proposal that's been put forward, I think, by Representative Jayapal, that the idea there is to just cover 100% basically of wages across the board. And I think that there are some issues there with implementation that may make it less timely in terms of how we would go about doing that than PPP. PPP has not been perfect. Let me be very clear about that. But it has gone through existing channels of lending that we already had in place. It's gone through existing mechanisms that were less difficult for us to stand up. And so when speed was our biggest concern, and it still is extremely important for us to be fast, PPP was the right thing to do because it went through our existing lending system. The ideas that have been put forward, I think, have some merit, but they would require us to set up some new systems and to do things that we really haven't done before in a different way. And so, I think that the right path forward for us is probably a combination of providing unemployment benefits to folks who, through no fault of their own, largely, because their area of the economy has been decimated, have lost their ability to earn a living so they can get through this period, but to really target our support as much as possible to the areas of our economy that cannot function as well during this pandemic. And there are parts of our economy, as we know, Chris, that regardless of if you're 100% open or not, folks are not going to be coming and engaging in that because it's risky for them to do so. And so I'm thinking here of anything where people have to gather indoors, which is a huge category of our economy. Certainly aviation, which we have an enormous stake in that in North Texas with our airports and with American and Southwest being headquartered here. And those are the areas that, to me, we have to make sure that we prop up because we need them when we emerge from this. We don't want to emerge without those areas of our economy. And so, I think we're going to continue down the road that we're on with PPP. And we were going to try and make it, as you said in our last round of questioning, try to make it more efficient, reach as many people as possible, and to support these areas of the economy that are the hardest hit. And they're going to continue to be very hard hit, likely until we have a vaccine.
And with that in mind, will you be voting to extend the pandemic unemployment compensation through the end of the year?
Well, I voted for that in the HEROES Act, and obviously it looks at this moment like the Senate will not take up that version of that bill. But I think that we will likely see, I've heard, and this is not negotiations that I've been a part of personally, but we've heard that that there are some considerations around that extension in this next package. And so I don't know if it'll be the same version that we had previously. But I think that there will be something and that it will be extended because the unemployment crisis is certainly not going away. And with sort of this, not second wave, because we really never got out of the first wave, but with this resurgence of the virus, not only in Texas, but in Florida, South Carolina, Arizona, certainly, and popping up still in other parts of the country in certain spots, that the need is still going to be there.
With that in mind, one of the questions asks, with the surge in cases and a lot of people feel that the economy really isn't going to get back to normal until people feel safe enough to go back to work, to go back to stores and things like that again. Is there any component of testing and tracing in the next bill?
I hope so. And there was in the HEROES Act that we passed. We had $75 billion specifically targeted, which is a lot of money when you think about that. Usually our annual budget for infrastructure is $100 billion. But we had $75 billion set aside for contact tracing and testing and for helping folks quarantine. What we're talking about here is really developing a public health infrastructure that we don't have right now by hiring hundreds of thousands of contact tracers to allow us to quickly identify where outbreaks are happening, try and trace as quick as possible and prevent them from spreading as rapidly as are occurring right now. Now, the problem with that for us is that in many cases, our testing is coming back too late. It's taking 8, 9, 10 days for the results of a test to come back. And by that point, it's very difficult to contact trace. So we want to speed up the rate of the testing, which means more investment in the supply chain to get the PPE necessary to conduct the test, to get the reagents that go into the test. And that's what all that money is intended to do. And I agree with the questioner, which is that there's no separating, in my opinion, our public health from our economic health. We will not recover fully, certainly economically, until we beat this virus. And fortunately for us, there are models for us to follow here. It's not that we're the only country in the world who has faced this. There are many countries who have done a much better job of containing COVID-19 than we have. And we can learn from what they've done right and learn from what we've done wrong throughout this process. South Korea is the country I always cite because they are so aggressive with every time they have a positive case, they so aggressively trace that they know within days how many folks have been infected by that positive case. And then they aggressively help that person quarantine and isolate, which is a part of this that we often don't talk about. Most people can't isolate and quarantine in their own home. So if you have a positive case in a multi-generational home with a young person, for example, the parent may get it, the grandparent may get it, grandchild may get it, because folks are living in close quarters in often cases in the areas that we're talking about where these outbreaks are happening. So taking vacant hotel rooms and providing folks with a place to quarantine is a part of the plan that I've supported and that we hope can be implemented. But the biggest shift here that has to happen, in my opinion, is a shift from just accepting that we're going to have widespread community spread of this virus. And that, yes, mask wearing is incredibly important. And I'm very glad that the governor has heeded Judge Jenkins's call for weeks now, that he's called for a statewide masking order. And I'm very glad that that has been heeded because it will save lives. It will help us limit the spread. But then to also be aggressively attacking this virus. In South Korea, they talk about the virus like it's a person, like it's an enemy. And they hunt it down and they find it and they tie it down. That's the approach I'd like to see us take, both for our public health and, of course, for our economic health.
We've seen from DC to Dallas, the Kennedy Center to the Perot, just the devastating effect the pandemic has had on the arts community. One of the questions asks, is there anything planned or has there been any special attention paid to helping the arts community through this so that when performances are able to take place, whenever that is, that they're still around to provide that venue?
Well, it's something that we all should care about because Dallas, in many ways, a lot of our economy is now revolves around tourism, around events, around folks coming to North Texas, whether it's for a convention or for business, certainly, eating in our restaurants, going to our museums, going to our theaters, and spending money there. And it's an important part of our economy now. And across the country, the story is the same. And we don't want to see these institutions go. And I certainly don't want to see them go. And there already was a hit in some giving to some of these areas because of the tax bill and some of the changes that were made previously before this pandemic hit. But of course, these entities are still eligible for PPP. 501c3s are eligible, and they can take advantage of that. And there are, I hope, discussions going on for us to have some targeted intervention for some of these parts of our economy. And that's what I was mentioning earlier, which is anything that requires folks to gather indoors or to provide a live experience of any kind. And it's theaters, it's the venues around them, it's also the vendors of those theaters and those venues. Those are the areas of the economy that I think we need to really be focusing on to try and provide aid. And PPP is one path towards that, but we may need to take other steps as well. And so, we've talked about it, and I know that it's part of the discussion, but we need to make sure that we keep our eye on this because we don't want to see these institutions go. And they are big economic attractors, not only in North Texas, but across the country. When we do emerge from this, we're going to want them.
And one final question, I want to tap your particular background and expertise. What does a successful return to work look like for college and pro football? Is it getting half the season? Is it no fans? Is it coming through a season with 70% of the players? What's that look like?
Well, I'm very worried about football because you have to understand right now the NBA is looking to reopen very soon. They've gone to, I think, Orlando. They're going to be in a bubble and they're going to test folks and they're going to try to keep them isolated while they're there. And you can do that with basketball teams. They are small, and not in size, of course, but in terms of how many people they have on the team. And their support staffs are much smaller. Football requires an enormous support staff. I mean, we're talking about in a college, 80 scholarship athletes, upwards of 40, 50, 60 walk-ons, enormous athletic training staffs to treat those folks, enormous equipment staffs to provide them with the equipment they need, the coaching, and everything that goes into a football team. It's a huge venture with a lot of people involved. And so I'm very concerned that it's going to be impossible to prevent the spread of the virus in these settings, particularly because what we've seen in institutionalized settings where people are gathering and having to spend time together, if the virus gets in there, whether it's a nursing home or an aircraft carrier or a football team, it will move very quickly because it's so transmissible. And so, I'm very concerned about it. There are some proposals that are being discussed, and I think that they're worth considering for college football to start in the spring and to try and make sure, get to the point where we're either doing a better job of controlling this virus or have a therapeutic or a vaccine in place so that we can then have a normal college football season in the spring. We can get it done in time for them to then go on to the NFL if they're able to do that and things like that. On the NFL side, it's a little bit different because these are professionals and you can ask them to take risks that I wouldn't be comfortable asking college students to take. And they also have the money to provide protections that may not be able to be done at that same scale at a college level. So I hope the NFL has a plan in place. I've been reading about it. I'm not sure they do to try and keep their players as isolated and quarantined as possible and to test constantly and rapidly and really be aggressive about it. Because if you get a virus into a team and you're running into each other and sweating on each other and breathing on each other the way you have to do in football, and there's just no way around it, it will spread very quickly. And we all want to see sports come back. I miss sports. I desperately miss it. And I think we particularly when we have so much politics and horrible things going on in the country in many cases, and people being worried about their livelihood, having that distraction and the inspiration that athletes can provide. Seeing a kid come from nowhere, come from nothing, and do something incredible inspires us all. Those are the stories that we're going to miss, and we already are missing. So we need to be smart about it, and I hope we can.
All right, thank you for that perspective. I think it's something we can all agree on. We're all missing sports right about now. Representative Allred, thank you so much. I want to turn it back over to Dale Petrosky, the president and CEO of Dallas Regional Chamber. Dale?
Sorry, I had my video off. I apologize for that. Thank you, Chris. Always such a treat to listen to Congressman Allred. He's so well informed, obviously does his homework, does his great job of representing us, always thoughtful, always balanced, calls them as he sees them. I think that's the way every elected official ought to be. And after listening to you, Congressman, I think about infrastructure. If that isn't a bipartisan issue, I don't know what a bipartisan issue is. I mean, that's one that everybody should be able to get behind so that we can get ready for the future. And I'm also glad that you mentioned the DRC is there to help people to get some of that federal stimulus money as well. I know your office does a great job of helping folks, but we're here too. If people don't know where to turn, thanks for pointing them our way as well. Chris, we have something in common. You probably don't even know this, but we're both from Detroit. We were both born and raised in Detroit. I've been meaning to reach out to you because I learned that recently. So I'll be giving you a call and we'll share some stories about growing up in Detroit. But thanks for doing a great job with the interview today. You're a pro, and love watching you on WFAA too. Thank you. Big thanks to Joe and McCarthy and Bob and Jacobs for sponsoring today. You guys are two of the great members of the Dallas Regional Chamber. Love everything you do for us, and we really do appreciate it. Also, a big thanks to Texas Instruments and our great friend Virginia Schaefer. She's supposed to be sitting in this chair right now and saying the closing remarks. Something came up, she couldn't do it, so I'm pinch hitting for Virginia today. But they're a big supporter, and they played a big role in today's event as well. Please remember to visit our website, dallaschamber.org, for a recap of this event and for any in-depth news and analysis and other resources of what the future of work looks like in this changing world. Thanks again for being with us, and we'll see you next time.